We have off again, on again on Sunday mornings been talking about the book of Hosea. This morning I want to begin in Hosea chapter 8, and because chapter divisions are basically meaningless in Hosea, as they're meaningless in a lot of places, we're looking at Hosea 8 verse 8 through 9 verse 9. For a full discussion about why chapter divisions are meaningless, come back tonight where we discuss it in our Q&A session. In Hosea, and really this is, I think of this more as part of a larger section, but the problem was that the lesson was getting too long, so I broke it into two parts, and that's why we're on part 2 this morning, where we look at this idea of Israel's false trust, Israel's misplaced trust. Hosea has been indicting the nation over and over and over because of something called harlotry, or this idea, and of course it's a bit difficult to imagine an entire nation prostituting herself. What we're looking at is a spiritual harlotry in which they have gone astray, in which they have taken every lover imaginable except the one which they were supposed to be faithful to, the Lord. And this, of course, has led to the inevitable problems that Israel is facing, including their judgment that is coming upon them by God. And to kind of give an overview of the larger section, we're talking about trust in the nations, trust in kings and idols, trust in the nations again, because we can't stress that enough, trust in altars and temples, and finally, as a result of all of the trusts that they placed in the wrong things, we get to the result in chapter 9 of judgment. Now, the last time, which was 2 weeks ago, I think, last time we talked about the first two items on this list, the trust in the nations in chapter 7, the trust in kings and idols at the beginning of chapter 8. And really, again, it's hard to draw sectional divisions. Some of these are kind of, arbitrary as a tool to help me. And hopefully it's helpful to others as well. But if anybody ever actually works out what the real structure of Hosea is, I would love to see it. In Hosea chapter 8, in verse 7, he concluded with saying, "They sow the wind, they reap the whirlwind. The standing grain has no heads, it yields no grain, and should it yield, strangers would swallow it up." Well, that last bit, strangers swallowing up the crops of Israel, is kind of a catchword that leads into the next thing he says in verse 8. Israel is swallowed up. They are now among the nations, like a vessel in which no one delights. For they have gone up to Assyria like a wild donkey, all alone. Ephraim has hired lovers. Even though they hire allies among the nations, now I will gather them up and they will begin to diminish because of the burden of the king of princes. And there, verses 8 through 10, we have this problem of false trusts in the nations. After saying that strangers will swallow up the harvest of Israel, which wouldn't amount to much since they were sowing wind in the first place, he says that Israel will be swallowed up. Not only is Israel like a poor farmer that sows the wind and reaps the storm, they're also the worthless crop that is engulfed by the nations. Hosea continues to be the master of the mixed metaphor, because in verse 7, they're sowing the crop, but in verse 8, they are the crop. And so, the prophets like to do that a lot. And here in our Psalms class, we're going to be running into a lot of mixed metaphors that we see throughout these scriptures. And then, of course, he describes them in verse 8. Not only are they the crop that is swallowed up by the nations, they are also the vessel in which no one delights. They are that clay pot, that piece of junk that's sitting in your garage that you've forgotten existed, and then one day you clean it out and you throw it away because it has no real purpose. They are that vessel in which no one delights. The thing that the nations don't want. They break it, they throw it away. In verse 9, it says they have gone to Assyria. We'll talk about trust in the nations. Historically, what had happened was the northern kingdom of Israel made an alliance with the Assyrians. During the reign of Menachem, king of Israel, they paid 1,000 talent tribute to Tiglath-Pileser III, who was then the king of Assyria. The book of Kings calls him by the name Pul. But what had happened, of course, was they made this alliance. It was essentially the ancient equivalent of protection money, is what it is. We pay you a huge tribute, and in return, you keep the other nations from beating up on us. Well, a lot of good that did, as we're going to find out. Eventually, Menachem's son was assassinated and replaced by somebody who didn't like Assyria that much and decided to revolt against them, didn't want to pay the tribute. And then, of course, Pekah was assassinated by a guy who did want to pay the tribute and did want to be allied with Assyria, and that was Hosea. But then he decided he didn't want to be allied with Assyria anymore after Tiglath-Pileser died and Shalmaneser replaced him. He revolted, and then Shalmaneser decided, well, you can't do that. So he just came to Samaria, and the city was destroyed. Although it's a little weird because Shalmaneser dies the same year that Samaria is destroyed, so there's this endless debate about whether he did it or his successor did it, but that's the Assyrians for you. Anyhow, so they've gone up to Assyria. They've gotten involved with this nation that they think is going to save them. They put all this confidence in their foreign alliance. He uses this imagery. They went up to Assyria like a wild donkey, all alone. Well, what does a wild donkey have to do with anything? Now, some people suggest, of course, that it's a play on words with Ephraim, because the word wild donkey shares a few consonants with the word Ephraim. I don't know, maybe. Some people point out, well, Ishmael was called a wild donkey of a man, Genesis 16:12, is constantly in conflict with everyone. But another instance that fits nicely in Hosea's harlotry metaphor is the way Jeremiah uses this expression in Jeremiah chapter 2 and verse 24, where he says that a wild donkey, well, I'll back up. Verse 23, Jeremiah 2, how can you say, I am not defiled? I have not gone after the Baals. Look at your way in the valley. Know what you have done. You're a swift young camel, entangling her ways. A wild donkey, accustomed to the wilderness, that sniffs the wind in her passion. In the time of her heat, who can turn her away? All who seek her will not become weary. In her month, they will find her. Keep your feet from being unshod and your throat from thirst. But you said it is hopeless. No, for I have loved strangers, and after them I walk. And so the idea in Jeremiah personifies the people chasing after the idols and chasing after their false alliances, chasing after their love of strangers. He portrays them like a wild donkey in heat, and she has this insatiable lust. It's got to be met now. And so that may be the idea that Hosea is getting at as well, is, it's like, the Lord is not enough for me. I've got to have something else. I've got to have this alliance with the nations. I've got to have these idols. And, of course, she says, like a wild donkey, all alone, Ephraim has hired lovers. This idea of hiring lovers, again, fits with the image of prostitution. Israel is prostituting herself. And then this is the strange element of it, normally in the ancient world, as it is today, whenever you go to a prostitute is paid by the person who goes to her. But in Israel's case, Israel's prostituting herself, but she is the one who pays. She has actually had to hire these lovers for herself. This is an idea that Ezekiel picks up on as well. In Ezekiel chapter 16, in verses 33 and 34, the prophet writes, "But men give gifts to all harlots, but you give your gifts to all your lovers, to bribe them to come to you from every direction for your harlotries. Thus you are different from those women in your harlotries, in that no one plays the harlot as you do, because you give money, and no money is given you. Thus you are different." And so that's kind of the idea that's being conveyed here. Ephraim is, she's not doing it for the money. Doing it just she can't get enough of it. Can't get enough of the sin. Can't get enough of the idolatry. Can't get enough of the false trusts. It's like we have to chase the solution for its own sake. And therein is the real problem now. Because, if that's your perspective on life, to just chase depravity for depravity's sake, well, it's like C.S. Lewis once wrote, that the person will come to the end and realize that they spent their whole life doing neither what they ought to nor what they wanted. So it's that idea. And of course the end result, verse 10, they will begin to diminish, or perhaps more better translated, they will writhe because of the burden. The burden of the king of princes. Now this is kind of a difficult idea to get across. God is gathering them up. It's kind of like a harvest, but it's a figure for judgment here. There's a harvest appointed for them, and they are burdened. The donkey will be captured, pinned in, forced to carry burdens. And the burden is probably a reference to the tribute that they would have to pay, which I think the ESV actually says tribute here. They've hired this lover for themselves in Assyria, but what will happen? Well, they're going to have to writhe under the burden that Assyria places upon them, the tribute that puts forth. Although there are some translation issues with this verse, but we won't get into that unless somebody puts a question in the box about it. Verses 11 through 14, trust in altars and buildings. Since Ephraim has multiplied altars for sin, they have become altars of sinning for him. Though I wrote for him 10,000 precepts of my law, they are regarded as a strange thing. As for my sacrificial gifts, they sacrifice the flesh and eat it. But the Lord has taken no delight in them. Now he will remember their iniquity and punish them for their sins. They will return to Egypt, for Israel has forgotten his Maker and built palaces, and Judah has multiplied fortified cities. But I will send fire on its cities, that it may consume its palatial dwellings. Alright, well, now you didn't know you would be getting a math lesson today, but right now we're going to talk about multiplication, because that's what's all over this text. It's a little joke. Multiplication, because what have they been doing? Well, they've multiplied altars for their sins. God has given them a myriad of laws, but they don't listen to them. And they have many cities, but they don't. But those cities get burned anyway. Now, we'll talk about these altars first. What are these altars even for? He says in verse 11, they multiplied altars for sin, or another way you could read that is because the word sin and the word sin offering are the same term, it could be they multiplied altars for sin offering, but they became altars of sinning. That's what happened. By multiplying altars to atone for their sins, we're building altars, we're worshiping God, we've got convenient access points where we can atone for the sins of the people. But, of course, by multiplying these altars, they inadvertently turn out to multiply sin themselves. Now, of course, there's all kinds of problems. You have Deuteronomy 12, where you're not supposed to sacrifice anywhere except the central sanctuary that God chooses, which was in Jerusalem. So technically, every altar that was built for sin in this part of Israel is, you might argue, fits into that pattern. One writer says that Israel's intentions have boomeranged. The zeal for the altars was a means of dealing with sin to find forgiveness. Instead, it became a way of increasing the sins. It's like buying indulgences or something. Another writer, the altars were attracting the very judgment they were supposed to avert. And of course, if you remember from earlier in Hosea chapter 6 and verse 6, God said, I delight in loyalty rather than sacrifice. I would rather have your steadfast love, your covenant fidelity. I would rather you just do what I say than offer a bunch of sacrifices to make up for all the disobedience. To obey is better than to sacrifice, Samuel once told Saul. To heed than the fat of lambs. Now that's the idea here. God wishes the people would just listen to Him. Just do what He says. Just hearken to His voice. Sacrifice isn't His desire. But what did the people do? Well, they built all these altars because, maybe we can buy God off. Maybe if we just offer enough bulls and goats and lambs and rams, God will be okay with us. He'll be satisfied. It was the pagan mentality that you could feed your God by sacrificing to it. But of course, what kind of a God is that? God says Himself in Psalm 50 that, cattle on 1,000 hills are mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you. Now, of course, God has given them His own multiplication, a myriad of laws, 10,000 laws. Now, the rabbis counted them up and came up with 613 or something like that. So, substantially less than 10,000. But that's not the point. The point is that even though God has given them all these laws, myriads of laws, well, people still don't know Him. Implicitly, of course, you could go into the New Testament idea about how the law is not truly the answer to sin. Some laws were given so Israel could not keep them. Galatians 3 talks about how everyone under the law is cursed. James 2 says that breaking one law makes you a lawbreaker. Romans 7 has this long convoluted explanation for how the law used sin to bring about disobedience and death. And so, the truth is that the list of rules isn't the answer. Knowing God is the answer. If you think that Christianity is about keeping a list of do's and don'ts, your Christianity is going to fail. The reason why is because, the list of rules is impossible to live under. Just keep them all really closely. Well, that'll lead to failure as surely as building altars for sin offering leads to more sin. The answer isn't keep trying to, just keep the rules, but ignore the rule maker. Knowing God is the answer. Because if you know God, guess what? You have someone to pardon you when you inevitably do break the rules, and you will. Knowing God, of course, means one consequently knows His law by extension. Hosea seems to be making that point as well, that, the problem isn't that you didn't keep the rules. The problem is that they're regarded as a strange thing. That you have no idea what I'm talking about. That you didn't even listen to them. You didn't even try. And at least try. Knowing God means one knows the law by extension. You can't know God without knowing His Word, without knowing His law. But there's a lot of people that know the law, that know the Word, and don't know the God behind it. That happens all the time. You got guys that get their PhD in what the Scriptures say. They don't believe a word of it. So it's just a historical curiosity to them, like one might study mythology or Civil War history or something like that. If you know the law without God, you're incidentally gutting true knowledge of the law, taking away what matters most about it, gutting the very essence of the law, to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. There's a lot of people that know the law, but don't know the lawmaker. And of course, the result of this is that God no longer delights in their sacrifice. He remembers their iniquity. But we have here this other idea of the many cities, the many palaces, dwellings. There's kind of an interesting point that can be made here. Palace could be understood as a temple. The word for temple and palace in Hebrew are actually the same term. Because they multiplied altars, God will turn their city into a giant altar. He will turn their palaces, their temples, their buildings, many of their structures that they built for themselves, the monuments to their own success. Well, God can just burn all that to the ground. And He invokes the language of Amos here. Will send fire on the cities that it may consume its palatial dwellings. And the point is not that God is opposed to people having cities, or that God is opposed to people having strong buildings. The point is that God is opposed to the idea that such a structure could ever stand without His help. What does the psalmist say? Solomon wrote in Psalm 127, "Unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain, those that build it." God is opposed to the idea that a city can stand without Him, that a house could stand without Him, that, as the Bolton article talks about, that you could build your paneled house while the house of the Lord lies desolate, and then expect it to stand. Oh, well, we built a lot of altars. We offered a lot of sacrifices. No. Or, since we don't live in their world, we live in this world. Oh, well, I went to church every Sunday. I had perfect attendance. But do you know the Lord? Knowing the Lord is the key to all of this. I hate the Lord's Supper. Yes, but do you know the Lord whose supper you're eating? That's the key to this whole thing. And of course, he talks about this judgment here in verses 13 and 14. Verse 13 makes a remark about they will return to Egypt, which I do want to mention briefly here. When he says Israel will return to Egypt, and he says this a couple more times in Hosea, he's not talking about literal Egypt. He's not talking about... because Egypt is due west in the opposite direction of where God's actually going to send them to captivity in Assyria. The point is, of course, what Egypt represented for Israel. Egypt represented a state of bondage and enslavement. Before they were ever created as a nation, they were trapped in slavery to the Egyptians. And the Lord brought them out of that captivity, out of that slavery. Well, then the Lord's going to send them back to Egypt, by which he really means Assyria, the nation that will enslave them again and put them in captivity again. And that is the point that he makes. He eventually gets to it in chapter 11 and verse 5. They will not return to the land of Egypt, but Assyria, he will be their king, because they refused to return to me. Now, the other element, of course, fire will destroy their city. We talked about that. And in verse 14, God will remember their iniquity. If Israel has forgotten his makers and built palaces, so God's going to remember their sin. And verse 13, which is kind of an interesting twist in the story. The nation that forgets God has their sins remembered. Those who remember God, he remembers their sins no more. Now, moving on, chapter 9, the judgment. This is where he really lowers the boom. Do not rejoice, O Israel, with exultation like the nations, for you have played the harlot, forsaking your God. You've loved harlot's earnings on every threshing floor. Threshing floor and winepress will not feed them. The new wine will fail them. They will not remain in the Lord's land, but Ephraim will return to Egypt, and in Assyria they will eat unclean food. They will not pour out drink offerings of wine to the Lord. Their sacrifices will not please him. Their bread will be like mourner's bread. All who eat of it will be defiled, for their bread will be for themselves alone. They will not enter the house of the Lord. What will you do on the day of the appointed festival, and on the day of the feast of the Lord? For behold, they will go because of destruction. Egypt will gather them up. Memphis will bury them. Weeds will take over their treasures of silver. Thorns will be in their tents. The days of punishment have come. The days of retribution have come. Let Israel know this. The prophet is a fool. The inspired man is demented because of the grossness of your iniquity and because your hostility is so great. Ephraim was a watchman with my God, a prophet, yet the snare of a birdcatcher is in all of his ways. There's only hostility in the house of his God. They have gone deep in depravity, as in the days of Gibeah. He will remember their iniquity. He will punish their sins. That's pretty rough. Do not rejoice. No rejoicing. Oh, we were supposed to rejoice always. What happened? Why no rejoicing? Well, let me count the ways. We have an end to prosperity in verse 2. End to the agricultural prosperity. The crops, the grain, the new wine, they all fail. We have captivity in Egypt. In Egypt in quotes, it's really Assyria. Having no food in the Lord's land, the people are forced elsewhere. Hosea uses Egypt and Assyria interchangeably here. They're described as eating unclean food, which, the idea there is, in captivity, of course, the people do not have the liberty to choose between clean and unclean food. This is a problem that Ezekiel addresses as well in Ezekiel chapter 4. But there's a sense in which Hosea is hinting that all of the meat is defiled in captivity, in verse 4, because it's all eaten away from the sanctuary of the Lord. And for Hosea's oracle to make any sense, it seems to assume that the people still cared about the cleanness of food, which is what I find interesting about this whole bit. Your punishment is you're going to have to eat unclean food. Well, fine, I don't care about that. Except that the people, I think, did care about that. That's why he brings it up. So here's the irony. These people, why would they be conscious about eating clean or unclean food? And this is the humorous bit. You can tell that Israel was conscious about this because archaeology is what it is. You know what the main difference between an Israelite city and a not Israelite city is? And when an archaeologist is digging it up, whether or not there are pig bones buried in the city. And if there's no pig bones, they say it's almost always an Israelite city. So apparently, in spite of their complete unfaithfulness to almost every aspect of the covenant, they seem to care about not eating pork quite deeply. Well, at least we don't eat pork. We're good. The Lord loves us. Well, really? The people, this is the irony, the people are so conscious about that one aspect of the law, eating unclean food, but they weren't careful to be obedient or submissive to God in all the details of their life. Oh, we really understand Leviticus 11 really well. Yeah, but you missed all the times in the law where he said, don't worship idols. Don't build graven images for yourself. Don't intermarry with the nations who will seduce you to play the harlot after their gods. Well, at least we're straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. We kept the little thing, which we were supposed to be keeping, but we didn't keep the big thing that mattered more, that you were also supposed to be keeping. This is why do you think Jesus was so upset in Matthew 23? He says, you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, but you neglect the weightier provisions of the law. Justice, mercy, and righteousness. These things you ought to have done without neglecting the others, is what he says. And the point is not that there was anything wrong with keeping the little things. The problem is that if you're going to keep the little things and not keep the big things, then you look kind of ridiculous. And God sees that as ridiculous. So what happens? Well, they're going to lose those things that they love so much, those rituals that they love so much. They don't get to pour out drink offerings. They don't get to eat clean food. They don't get to have, verse 5, appointed festivals. No more drink offerings, no more sacrifice, no more holy bread, no more appointed feasts. None of those things will be possible in exile. Because you spend all your time worshiping idols instead of the true God. So you're going to be deprived of worshiping the true God. Now, that's true in an eternal sense as well. You worship the gods of this world now, you'll be barred from the true assembly of the Lord in the judgment, in the eternal assembly. Verse 6, they're harvested by Egypt. They go, behold, they will go because of destruction. Egypt will gather them up. Memphis will bury them. I don't know how Memphis, Tennessee got into there. Well, it's Memphis, Egypt, but I'm sure there's some kind of a football joke that I could make that I have no idea what. But since I know nothing about it, I would be completely clueless. All right. Let's see. Memphis was the chief city of Egypt and became the burial ground for their silver, their wealth. They will bury their wealth. Weeds will take over their treasures of silver. Which could refer to their monetary wealth, but it could also refer to those nice little silver idols that they made that they loved so much. Well, your precious silver idols, you know what they did? Did they save you from the invaders? No. They get thrown away, they get buried, they get covered with thorns. Good job protecting the people. Now, see how good a job they do amongst the thorns and the weeds. Alright, so then, of course, verses 7 and 8. Alright, so I'm not sure how to cover verses 7 and 8. The prophet is a fool. The problem is that there's a really big translation issue and it's not clear which one's correct. So I will just give you the options. Mine, of course, my version I'm reading up here, the Hosea's critique of the false prophets. Israel, know this. The prophet is a fool. The inspired man is demented because of the grossness of your iniquity and because your hostility is so great. Ephraim was a watchman with my God, a prophet, yet the snare of a birdcatcher is in all of his ways. So the idea, of course, is that in this instance, that Hosea is criticizing the false prophets. He says, Ephraim, you were supposed to be a true prophet. You were supposed to espouse the words of the Lord. But instead, you just espouse all these lies, all these made-up things. So the prophet is a fool. The other side of it, of course, found in the Net Bible and other versions, is it's not Hosea saying this, it's Hosea quoting the people, and the people are mocking him as a true prophet. Which there's precedent for that in Scripture too. And in fact, what the Net Bible translates it as, the prophet is considered a fool. The inspired man is viewed as a madman. And of course, that controversy extends into verse 8, how you view the statement in verse 8. If Hosea is insulting the false prophets, then the nation Ephraim is a watchman with my God, a prophet, yet the snare of a birdcatcher is in all his ways. Which, if that's true, it creates I think this is the only time in the Bible that the nation would be collectively called a prophet, actually. On the other hand, if it's Israel insulting Hosea, then the other translation is, the prophet is a watchman over Ephraim on behalf of God, yet traps are laid for him along all of his paths. So, that's the short version. If you want the long version, again, we have a Q&A box for people who... And believe me, I love to answer technical questions like this, but some people don't love to listen to it. So that's why we're keeping it short this morning. Verse 9, I think, is the most condemning statement of all. They have gone deep in depravity, as in the days of Gibeah. He will remember their iniquity. He will punish their sins. Gibeah. Israel's compared to Gibeah. Now, if you don't know your history or you forget place names easily, Gibeah sounds kind of generic, right? And Gibeah is known for two things. Number one, they were the hometown of Saul in 1 Samuel 11 and verse 4. And Hosea is critical of the kingship throughout, so some people connect it with that. But the other problem, of course, is that Gibeah was also known as that city at the end of the book of Judges, in Judges chapters 19 through 21. The story goes, you read Judges 19, that's the place where the Levite travels with his concubine, and the Levite's so insistent, this is it's important that we sleep in an Israelite city. I don't trust these foreign Canaanite cities. They're going to abuse us and mistreat us. So they go to the Israelite city of Gibeah in the tribe of Benjamin. They lodge with this one man who warns them very emphatically not to spend the night in the square. And while they're in his house, a group of men in the city surround the house and demand that the Levite and his concubine be given up so that they can have relations with them, forcibly. Which sounds an awful lot like another story in the Bible, Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, of course, what happens, this story ends differently because there's no angels on the scene to save the day. The Levite throws his concubine out the door, and the men of the city of Gibeah proceed to rape her, and then, of course, the Levite comes out in the morning and says, hey, we need to get going, at which point she's already dead. That story is probably top contender incident for the most wicked, embarrassing, and despicable event in Israel's history, by far. It's hardly complimentary. So when Hosea writes, they have gone deep in depravity as in the days of Gibeah, you know exactly what he's talking about. That's an insult. Because of their great wickedness, God says He will remember their iniquity. He will punish their sins. And it's on that note I want to make a brief remark, a warning, if you will, to conclude this lesson. The story of Gibeah is an obvious reminder of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. They're both Genesis 19 and Judges 19. The chapter numbers are coincidental, but the story goes, travelers come to the city in the evening. A foreigner in the city notices them. The travelers want to spend the night in the square, but the host insists that the travelers lodge with him instead. Excuse me. The host and the travelers eat a meal together. The house is surrounded by wicked men. The mob demands that the guests be surrendered for sex, and the host protests and begs them not to do this. There's an instance where substitute females are offered. And then at that point, the stories kind of part ways with each other. But what's disturbing about Gibeah is that it happened in Israel. Sodom and Gomorrah, they were wicked cities. All of those are just horrible places to be. But Gibeah, that's in Israel. That's the tribe of Benjamin. They should have known better. And it isn't the only time in the Bible that Israel is deliberately compared with Sodom and Gomorrah. Isaiah does it. Jeremiah does it. Ezekiel calls Sodom the younger sister of Judah in Ezekiel 16 and verses 44 through 52. Lamentations 4 verse 6 remarks that the sins of Jerusalem were greater than Sodom's sins. And even in the New Testament, Jesus gets in on the Sodom comparison act. He talks about all these different cities. I'll read Matthew chapter 11. In Matthew chapter 11 and verses 23 and 24, Jesus says, "You, Capernaum, will not be exalted to heaven, will you? You will descend to Hades. For if the miracles had occurred in Sodom, which have occurred in you, it would have remained to this day. Nevertheless, I say to you that it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom in the day of judgment than for you." He says that to the city of Capernaum because Capernaum didn't believe him after he performed all these miracles there. He says, if I performed those miracles in Sodom, Sodom would have repented. Sodom would have changed. And it would still be here today. So it's going to be more tolerable for them in the day of judgment than it was for you. That's a scary thing to happen. People who reject the power of the gospel, people who reject the words of Christ, the greatest of all revelations, will be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for them. Oh, but I'm here in church. I've accepted the gospel, right? Well, no. We're not even off the hook either. Can Sodom and Gomorrah happen in church? You bet it can. The New Testament compares false teachers creeping into New Testament congregations with the sins of Sodom. In the book of Jude does this, for instance. In the book of Jude, little book of Jude, I'll start reading in verse 3. Beloved, while I was making every effort to write about our common salvation, I felt the necessity to write to you, appealing that you contend earnestly for the faith which was once for all handed down to the saints. For certain persons have crept in unnoticed, those who were long beforehand marked out for this condemnation, ungodly persons who turn the grace of our God into licentiousness and deny our only Master and Lord Jesus Christ. These are people that sneak into church and do this. And what does Jude compare them to? Verse 5, I desire to remind you, though you know all things once for all, that the Lord, after saving a people out of the land of Egypt, subsequently destroyed those who did not believe. And angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode, He has kept in eternal bonds under darkness for judgment of the great day. 3, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, since they in the same way as these indulged in gross immorality and went after strange flesh, they are exhibited as an example in undergoing the punishment of eternal fire. And you think, what? In church? You know, I mean, you think rampant sexual violence can happen in church? Well, I don't know, I've heard so many horror stories. I mean, even that shouldn't surprise you at this point. But Sodom can manifest her horrific legacy in any congregation that decides to reject the authority of God. When Hosea writes and says that they have gone deep in depravity as in the days of Gibeah, maybe they didn't really literally duplicate the days of Gibeah, but you know what they did? They put their trust in the nations. They put their trust in the idols. They put their trust in their altars. They put their trust in their little rituals. They put their trust everywhere but in the Lord. And for that, He compares them to Gibeah and implicitly compares them to Sodom. And that's brutal. We who have been saved by the blood of Christ, we who have repented of our sins and been conformed to the Lord and been immersed into His death, burial, and resurrection through baptism, we who have devoted ourselves to Him, even we can fall if we do not take care, if we forget the Lord. If we forget the Lord, He's going to remember something about us that we would rather Him not remember. Our iniquity, which will pile. And now that those of us who have had Christ then turn around and reject a relationship of Christ for something counterfeit, something inferior, something plastic. Those of us who do that, well, it's like Jesus said at Capernaum. It'll be more tolerable in Sodom in judgment than for you. That scares me. And I realize that fear is not the only reason to follow the Lord. But fear is a powerful motivator, and the Lord uses it throughout the Scriptures. Why not love the Lord instead? Why not know the Lord? Why not press on to know Him, as Israel should have done? Let us take care, brethren, that we do not choose our self-will over God's will. Take out your songbooks as we're concluding this morning. Let us take care that we do not choose self-will over God's will. Rather, we must be vigilant to conform to the instruction of God, to earnestly contend for the faith, for the trust, rather than putting our trust in things of this world, the nations. I hear people express trust in the weirdest things, I saw one today. It was like, put my trust in the free market system. Another, I put my trust in socialism. Those are trust in economic systems. They're not going to save you. The Lord's going to save you. Don't trust in these political ideas or in these economic ideas or in these philosophical ideas. Trust in the Lord, because He and He alone has the power to deliver. And these passages in Hosea, they're brutal, but they're necessary. And if we fail to learn from the mistakes of Israel, we will surely repeat them. If you're here this morning, you don't know the Lord like you should. You've been thinking, maybe that's me. Maybe I need to get my life right. Maybe I've just been putting my trust in the wrong thing in every direction. Maybe you're here and you've never been immersed into Christ for the forgiveness of your sins. Now is an appropriate time to let that be known. While together we stand and we sing the song that's selected.